minutes. There are no guests. So.
Oh, see.
I read the book. You see.
Signed Boundaries of London, Ordinary Meeting, Thursday, 14th of October 2021, Burlington House and online. Before I go any further, can you all hear me clearly? We've had a lot of trouble with the speakers, the audio over the last few weeks, but okay.
John?
What?
Our online fellows need to hear as well. That's the issue. Right.
Ordinary Meeting, Thursday, 14th of October 2021, Burlington House and online. Is that okay? Professor Martin Millett, President and Chair. The minutes of the previous Ordinary Meeting of Thursday, 7th of October 2021 were read and signed. These certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The following, being in attendance, having signed the obligation required by the statute, were duly admitted fellows: Rowan McLaughlin and Kelsey Wilson Lee. The following communication was then laid before the Society: Revisiting the Origins of Prehistoric Malta, Temples, Landscapes and Change, the work of the ERC Frazers Project, 2013 to 2018, by Professor Caroline Malone, FSA, and Dr. Rowan McLaughlin, FSA. Thanks in return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting will be on Thursday, 21st of October, and closed the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Certificates. Sorry.
Thank you. There are 8 certificates this evening, and if I could just remind fellows, I'm reading the shorter version. If you want the full details, please look on the website. Joseph Kerner, BA, MA, PhD, Victor S. Thomas Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University, with research interests in the visual culture of Northern Europe. Karen Limper-Hertz, MA, PhD, Lead Curator in Cunabala and 16th century printed books at the British Library, with expertise in the history of early printed books, book collecting in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the history of bookbinding. John Lundqvist, BA, PhD, Senior Researcher in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History at Uppsala University, focusing on the Scandinavian Late Iron Age from 400 to 1050 CE, with an emphasis on the Vendel period. Alice Minter, BA, MA, Curator of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Collection at the V&A, with expertise in Huguenot goldsmiths, snuff boxes, Jewish collectors, and the Posher, Bernard Palissy. Paul Nash, PhD, Editor of the Journal of the Printing Historical Society, librarian, bibliographer, printing historian, and historical printer. Marina Papasco, PhD, Honorary Lecturer at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, whose research has focused on the protection of world cultural heritage. Toby Parker, BA, PhD, archivist and landscape historian, whose research includes work on the architectural history and landscape of the East India College and the Haileybury Estate. Benjamin Raffield, BA, MPhil, PhD, Senior Researcher in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History at Uppsala University, with expertise in the archaeology of Viking Age slavery and political instability.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you. Before we go on, could I make a couple of announcements. I omitted last week to tell fellows that the Morris Committee had been meeting and awarded grants totaling £7,500 to a series of church conservation projects. Council has met today. We had a long update and strategic discussion on the campaign to remain in Burlington House in our negotiations with government, and I could report that negotiations are going to be taking place with civil servants during November, which we hope will have a positive outcome. We also had a long discussion of the fellows' responses to the consultation on the affiliate membership scheme. We looked at the useful points raised by the consultation and are moving forward with that proposal to take to council to implement from next April. That will be coming to the anniversary meeting in April. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, and we welcome our lecturer, Dr Madeleine Pelling, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the Centre for 18th Century Studies at the University of York. Madeleine's an art historian who specialises in visual and material culture of 18th century Britain. She holds a PhD from the University of York and has held postdoctoral fellowships at the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art and the universities of Manchester and Edinburgh, as well as short-term fellowships, the Royal Archives, the Royal Historical Society, and the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale. So very pleased to welcome her this evening to give a lecture. I took a man over and began to dig Catherine Downes' excavations at Roman Warminster, 1786.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that everyone can hear me, including online, Daniel? Yeah, great, fantastic. Just while waiting for the screen to come down, I'd like to say thank you, obviously, for this invitation to speak here today. This is actually the first in-person talk that I've given, I think, since the British Society for 18th Century Studies conference in 2019, right before the lockdown, the first lockdown happened. So it's nice to be here in such an auspicious setting. The work that I'm presenting tonight, hopefully the technology will appear, is a sort of ongoing project that's broadly interested in 18th century women's engagement with the material culture of the past, whether that's through archaeological practices, collecting and curating in this period. And it's this particular piece of work is it's an interesting one. So in some ways, it is developed significantly since I proposed it as part of this program, but also, like I think every researcher in here, you know, the pandemic has meant a lack of access to archives. And so there are other areas of this work that I'm really keen to expand. So I'd be really interested to hear people's sort of feedback and questions afterwards. Okay. In 1801, tourists setting out from the fashionable Somerset spa town and armed with the newly published Excursions from Bath, written by the antiquary Reverend Richard Warner, might have been inclined to venture towards the prosperous town of Warminster, then known for its wool trade and the high density of coaching inns that serviced travellers across the West Country. 15 years earlier, Warner informed his readers, a field outside the town known as Pitt Mead became the site of an archaeological excavation. This programme of subterranean inquiry was particularly noteworthy, thanks in part to the discoveries made there, which included several intricate, though fragmented Roman mosaics, and a rich array of coins, pottery, and human remains. Equally significant was that the excavation had been conducted by a woman, one whose labours would have wider scholarly implications beyond the concerns of Warner's sightseeing readers. Warner describes in his book how, in the latter end of the year 1786, part of a Roman pavement was accidentally discovered, of which a Mrs. Down, who then resided at Warminster, being apprised, she visited the spot, examined it carefully, made further successful researches, took drawings of the remains, and transmitted them to the late Daines Barrington, who, communicating the same to the Antiquarian Society, they were published in the Archaeologia of 1787. Little is known of Catherine Downes, although the letter written to her by the Society of Antiquaries in London in 1786, read aloud by Secretary Barrington and subsequently copied into the Society minutes, now of course in the archive upstairs, provides some insight into a genteel woman with a keen interest in and knowledge of history. She was part, perhaps, of a local network of antiquaries. When a gentleman of Warminster requested a drawing of hers be sent to the society, quote, but neglected to send it, she took it upon herself to communicate her findings from the site at Pitmead, in what remains a rare example of a woman's contribution to this 18th century institution. Of the sketches that accompanied her report, Downes wrote, "The learned and honourable society may depend upon the accuracy of the drafter, as I took them all upon the spot, which no other person had the opportunity of doing. As to the execution, conscious as I am of a great deficiency, as I never had the least instructions, I can say with truth, say nothing but an ardent desire of preventing what most people think so important a discovery being hid from your learned body could have induced me to let it meet the eyes of taste and science." Asserting legitimacy in the textual and scholarly spaces of institutions like the Society at a time when women were disbarred from its meeting places was complex. At the Society gathering in which her letter was read aloud, Downes' words were prefaced by an apology from their author for their want of learned phrases and grammatical knowledge. And yet her voice, albeit filtered through that of Barrington, was subsequently inscribed into the pages of the Minute Book, a text central to the institution's collective identity and mission. Similarly, her preliminary sketches of the site were subsequently engraved by the Society's own James Bezier, translating them into the formal visual language of antiquarianism. Where women's access to knowledge institutions was curtailed in this period by gender discriminatory policies of membership, as well as geographical and social restrictions, for those financially and physically capable, archaeology promised intellectual reward, embodied experience, and even historic encounter. Its relative lack of regulation in comparison to the strict hierarchical and masculine encoded metropolitan societies meant women equipped with the means and curiosity to engage in excavation might begin to participate meaningfully in broader historiographical debates, uncovering and in some cases controlling access to important artifactual discoveries. Downes was not the only woman to be involved in archaeology in the 18th century, nor to contribute an important report to the Society. 5 years earlier, Elizabeth Rawdon, the Countess of Moira, wrote to the Society about the discovery of a bog body on her husband's land in County Down, Ireland. The report, the body, which was found with extensive grave goods and remarkably fragments of preserved textiles and hair, was believed by the Countess to be an inhabitant of ancient Ireland, one from whom she drew direct lines of inheritance, looking to connect her own socio-political status as the English-born wife of an Anglo-Irish peer to emerging ideas of a noble Gallic history. There's little to connect Catherine Downes and Lady Moira, although both their names rather pleasingly do appear in the list of subscribers to John Burns' 1755, A Historical and Chronological Remembrancer, indicating at least a shared interest in the past. Of course, neither would have identified as archaeologists, a word that would not come into common usage until the century afterwards, and more likely both would have turned instead to the broader term of antiquary, if at all. Unlike Downes, who was most probably a middling woman and whose life leaves little trace in the archive, the survival of the Countess's correspondence and sustained scholarly interest in her Dublin salon enable us to formulate a much more comprehensive picture of her life and work. Both appear briefly in the landmark book Antiquaries by Rosemary Sweet, who is here, as rare examples of women's engagement in antiquarian work, and also in Susan Pearce and Anna Catalana's study of women's contributions specifically to the Society itself. Here, I'm interested in the ways that both women sought to platform their work within the scholarly spaces traditionally closed to them, but equally in how the same work was conducted within and sometimes beneath territories in which questions of land ownership and occupation, indigeneity, imperial violence, and lines of inheritance necessarily informed their approach. Breaking the surface of the land, dredging the earth, and bringing up the past were, I argue, as much political acts as they were practical exercises. The expansion of Britain and with it modes of historical knowledge down into the soil, whether through building work, landscape design, or indeed archaeology, happen alongside and in context of a rapid growing empire. And indeed, the two are intrinsically linked. While the case studies I focus on in this paper take place within England and Ireland respectively, it's important to locate contemporary archaeological endeavours within the geographical, economic, and sometimes violent structures enacted by Britain across the globe. And certainly some of these connections were already established in the 18th century. Robbie Richardson, for example, has discussed how prehistoric canoes excavated in the north of England were anachronistically attributed to Native American makers, whilst Amara Thornton is uncovering the ways in which enslaved Africans in the Caribbean were the regular and knowledgeable finders of archaeological materials relating to the island's indigenous populations, the implications of which are only now starting to be considered. Many of the excavations taking place in mid to late 18th century Britain tended to prioritise narratives of Roman occupation, focusing in particular on the remnants of military outposts and traces of technological infrastructure. Richard Hingley has discussed how the Roman Empire was framed as a desirable model for contemporary colonial practices and provided what he calls, quote, a modern concept for Englishmen who sought to dominate, control, and perhaps to civilize other contemporary, quote unquote, savages or barbarians in locations including Ireland, Highland Scotland, and North America. Material evidence of Roman occupation was particularly sought after across Britain. Giacomo Savani suggests that towns of Roman origins were celebrated for their glorious past, and antiquaries across the country were keen to increase the prestige of their rural communities through the discovery of Roman antiquities. But as Crystal Lake has recently underscored, just what those objects, or to use her term, artifacts, told the inquirers of the 18th century about the past was a point of dispute. Questions of just how to identify, to value, and to read this stuff, variously broken, cracked, fractured, incomplete, and inconsistent, quickly became politicized and open to interpretation. Discovery of archaeological remains occurred most regularly in landscapes submitted to extensive alterations, building programs, and Lockean attempts to harness and cultivate wilder topographies. As towns, cities, and country estates were transformed, the 18th century sociable world was quite literally laid on top of the material traces of the lives and events that had come before. And in an overwriting that saw a complex conflation of the two at the points where the ground was broken and the past resurfaced. In the city, I appear to be missing a slide there, there we go. In the city of Bath, for example, discovery of Roman villas and the now famous Roman bathhouse coincided with the city's burgeoning fashionability and a prolific development program that led to the unearthing of several key archaeological sites. An interest in these sites, if I just go back to the previous slide, did run to the very top of British society, and this is a plan of the Roman baths at the city of Bath from the personal collection of George III. So questions of who might access objects once they had surfaced from the ground, what histories they told and what they were worth, were as pertinent in the 18th century as they are today. In his 1765 description of Bath, the architect John Wood the Younger detailed how workmen digging the foundations for the city's new assembly rooms was met with what he terms a vast number of bodies that had been buried there underneath. Wood recalls how one of the workmen, more arch than the rest, removed what he took to be several horses' teeth and bones from the graves and set about amusing the public with tales of men of a gigantic size. This was a lucrative, if irreverent, business. The same workman Wood notes, quote, received his bounty so liberally that he soon appeared in fine linen and the best broadcloth garments by it, thus raising important questions about the valuation of archaeological materials alongside a contemporary consumer market and their absorption into local and national economies. Records from the Old Bailey provide a similar glimpse of the potential commercial, legal, and legal valuations of such items. In London in May 1781, for example, one William Ives was indicted for breaking and entering the dwelling house of an Alexander Wilson about the hour of 6 in the night and stealing a Roman sword carved with a wooden handle, value 10 shillings. Women also capitalized on such valuations within their own local economies. In his 1801 guidebook, Excursions from Bath, mentioned at the start of this paper, Richard Warner describes a Mrs. Smith of Dyer Street in Cirencester, who displayed in her home a fragment of Roman mosaic discovered near the town and available for the curious to contemplate in exchange for a small fee. The value of and access to archaeological discoveries became a point of dispute and underscored existing social as well as gender divides. The Enclosure Acts of the 1770s saw landowners granted new privileges and local workers displaced. In traversing such landscapes, elite and middling women, looking for the material remnants of the past, came into contact with the lower classes in ways that they may not previously have done. And indeed, the anxious performance around class hierarchy and its intersections with gender are characteristic elements of 18th century archaeological investigation. Discoveries in the earth, for example, might, for example, be gifted by their original finders to their so-called social betters, as in 1755, when the poet Mary Masters described in a letter how I have procured a few pieces of old coin which were lately found by a peasant in the neighbourhood, and a few days since had a small brazen bust given me, newly taken up near the ruined walls. Some of the coin bear the image of Constantine, some are more antique. They are all of them very small and mere trifles, but such trifles as I am pleased with. The complex negotiation of access to historical material in the landscape certainly highlighted social and gender inequalities. When the novelist Catherine Hutton undertook a lengthy expedition to the Lake District and across country along the remnants of Hadrian's Wall with her father, the Birmingham historian William Hutton, he insisted that she stay behind as he travelled alone through the northeast portion, a terrain he claimed that was full of bandits. Reports of new discoveries were regularly inflected with classist notions of elite intellectualism set against the apparent nonchalance of the working classes, depicted at best as inconveniently ignorant and at worst willfully malicious. In 1779, Scottish-born Lady Sarah Riddell wrote to the Society to describe the discovery of an axe head made during improvements to her estate near Dumfries. As I have ever been fond of comparing the former ages with the present, she wrote of the investigations, I cannot let any opportunity pass without indulging myself. In the same letter, Riddell describes a prehistoric stone circle on her land that had been destroyed, she complained, in our absence by the ignorance of our steward, who suffered the workmen repairing the road to break up the rocks and get gravel for covering it. In Warminster, issues of access to land, class hierarchies, and women's place within this system were no less prevalent. Catherine Downes testified in her account to the Society that the site at Pitmead, where she would go on to uncover the Roman villa, was reportedly first discovered, not by her, but by a local scholar and his son, in turn after agricultural workers draining the fields had hit upon a mosaic pavement. The land on which the excavation took place belonged to Thomas Tyne, Lord Weymouth, whose seat at nearby Longleat House became a repository for much of the excavated material, a detail further complicated when many of the finds unearthed at the site were afterwards stolen by locals, presumably intent on selling them on. Upon reading of the initial discoveries made there, Downes, perhaps astonishingly for a woman of her social standing, sought permission to expand the scope of the investigation. It was granted. I took a man over, she later wrote to the Society, and began to dig. Instantly, Downes hit upon the top of a pavement and traced it to its full extent, aided by the local man she had hired, as well as several workers supplied by Lord Weymouth. She developed an impressively, really recognizably modern methodological approach to the excavation, in which her corresponding sketches, which you can see translated into print on the left there, anatomized a sort of bird's eye view of the site alongside upscaled individual finds. A Roman villa as well as a bathhouse was soon revealed. The location and extension of trenches was informed by following identifiable features, including mosaic floors, a wall 2 feet thick, and even a bath. The floor, she writes, of a very hard cement, composed of something extremely white like marble. Discovery and interpretation went hand in hand, curtailed only, she tells us, by the severity of the weather. something I'm sure lots of archaeologists will recognise. The perils of field archaeology and its lack of regulation are also evident in Downes' account, in which she records how 3 of the 4 mosaics discovered there were variously torn apart and stolen by thieves, with the resultant print by James Bazier, memorialising not only the objects found during the excavation, but also those that were lost. Only one square and virtually intact mosaic floor decorated in a circular design was saved, Downes reports, by the ingenuity of Lord Weymouth's surveyor, who carried it to his lordship's seat at Longleat, where it will be safe from the depredations of the vulgar. And somewhat ironically, it has since disappeared from Longleat's collection. Part of Downes' success in infiltrating the Society's publications in this way may have lain in her explicit engagement with concurrent antiquarian debates, in which her familiarity with the local landscape proved especially useful. Although she discovered prehistoric material at the Warminster site, including a burial mound, she dismissed much of its significance in favour of prioritising a Roman narrative of the site. In a parenthetical aside copied into the minutes, she identifies Warminster as the elusive Roman settlement Veluccio. The location of Veluccio had been a subject of regular contestation amongst earlier antiquaries, including William Stukely, Gale and Horsley, all of whom variously placed it at nearby Headington or Westbury. It was in fact the 16th century historian William Camden who placed Veluccio at Warminster. Camden's Britannia, which was first published in 1586, was a highly influential volume, and after the release of a second edition by Edmund Gibson over a century later, sparked particular interest in the Roman occupation. Downes' corroboration then of Camden's Veluccio signals her clear understanding of characteristically antiquarian interest in deploying the fabric of the past as evidence alongside published works, and proposes her discoveries as evidential proof of the historian's earlier theory. Among several smaller finds unearthed by Downes were pieces of a broken black urn, which she equates in her report rather fascinatingly to Mr. Wedgwood's teapots. That Downes chooses the popular products of industrialist potter Josiah Wedgwood in linking ancient and 18th century modes of manufacture, Roman and Georgian domesticities, and the embodied experiences that might accompany them is particularly striking, and speaks perhaps to the specific objectscape with which she was familiar and through which she might compare and understand those objects found in the Wiltshire soil. Significantly though, Wedgwood's black basalt, a type of stoneware first introduced in the 1760s, was most often used not in the creation of teapots, but vases, portrait medallions and plaques designed to echo Greek and Roman originals, including those collected by Wedgwood's friend and Society of Dilettanti member, Sir William Hamilton, famous, of course, himself for advancing archaeological fieldwork during early excavations of Pompeii. What might then first appear as a highly gendered reference to the accoutrements of a decorative and feminine domestic environment in which any genteel Georgian woman would be expected to be familiar is perhaps a rather more shrewd, knowledgeable, and maybe antiquarian-minded gesture to contemporary modes of classical reproduction, and even, stretching it slightly further, experimental archaeology. Across the sea in Ireland, antiquarian work was produced in an increasingly fraught political climate. In 1785, the Royal Irish Academy was founded against the backdrop of the White Boy disturbances and campaigns for agrarian autonomy, as well as further sectarian violence between the rival Catholic defenders and the Protestant Irishmen. As Claire O'Halloran has identified, a number of Protestant scholars begun to interest themselves in Gaelic culture, although most of them could not either speak nor read Irish, and to extol its virtues, she argues, as a repository for the early history of Ireland. Efforts to discern this history were regularly coloured within broader language of colonial discourse, with explicit comparisons made between ancient cultures in the British Isles and Ireland itself, and the indigenous populations of 18th century North America, Egypt, and the Indian subcontinent. Ireland's famous round stone towers, for example, were compared to Hindu temples. Within this context of British imperial expansion, the English-born Elizabeth Rawdon, Countess of Moira's work as a collector and antiquary held significant political sway. Her salon served as a nexus, collecting prominent figures in Dublin society, and even hosted Theobald Wolfe Tone, leader of the 1798 Irish Rebellion, although Amy Prendergast has cautioned us to read this, not to read this as an absolute indication of the Countess's own political convictions. What is clear is that her engagement in the ideas and materials of historic Ireland in efforts to legitimise and strengthen her standing and that of her husband, the Anglo-Irish peer Sir John Rawdon, as sympathetic colonial presences invested in at least a version of Irish history. And included on the right here is the Countess of Moira's calling card, which is in the collection of Sarah Sophia Banks at the British Museum. And if anyone recognises the building, I'd be really grateful to hear in the Q&A. The bog body associated with Lady Moira and the subject of her report to the Society of Antiquaries, afterwards published in the Archaeologia of 1785, was first discovered at Drumkeerig in County Down, not by her, but by a farmer cutting turf for his winter's fuel in the autumn of 1780. The find was only reported to the landowner, her husband, after a survey of the farmland had been ordered a year later. Afterwards, interviewing the farmer, the Countess reported how, quote, he discovered a skeleton laid with the feet to the west, and that the stature did not appear to exceed that of a very little woman, and that upon and about the bones there were many garments. What remained, she described, had, as the farmer thought them of no consequence, been torn up by children and pigs, and part of them suffered to lie abroad, tossed about the bog. The material qualities and historiographical potential of fragmented human remains were particularly compelling to the Countess. Indeed, years earlier in 1747, she had rather shockingly taken from the skull of Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, in his vault at St. Albans, a lock of hair which she described as so perfectly strong that she had it woven into rings to wear. Yeah, strange. Her 1780s report to the Society is, I argue, in many ways a rumination on specifically the female Irish body and its centrality in questions of colonial rule and local resistance. It appears in many forms in her account, in many iterations and open to many different treatments. It's diminished through starvation and, in the case of the bog body itself, decomposition, but it also appears as the means of performing and displaying narratives of national prowess. In attempting to date and identify the individual found in the peat, Lady Moira's account to the Society sets out contextual histories of regional territories in Ireland, devolved structures of governance, and local power struggles, presumably not unrecognisable to her 18th century contemporaries. She describes the territory in which the skeleton has been found was anciently held by the MacCurtains as a kind of palatine under the O'Neills, kings of Ulster. I therefore conjecture that the present object of my inquiry was one of that race, who had fallen prey to famine in consequence of the persecution of those humane methods my countrymen continued to employ in Elizabeth's reign to civilise the Irish and conciliate their affections to their conqueror. Her framing of English efforts to civilise the Irish is separated grammatically in her text for emphasis, I think, as criticism rather than condolence of an earlier colonial system of which she doesn't view herself being part. In a footnote beneath, Lady Moira asserts, it seems but candid to seize any opportunity of relating what the ancient Irish endured from the English, since the cruelties of the former were generally stated as not having arisen from provocation. Underscoring her claims of Irish suffering at the hands of English brutality, she includes anecdotes taken from Finis Morrison's 17th century History of Ireland, reprinted in Dublin in 1735 and likely part of her library, which details the horrors of state-sponsored starvation, in which she specifically notes women were executed for killing and eating their offspring, and in one instance, a group of children were discovered cannibalizing their long-dead mother. Of the bog body itself, Lady Moira describes its mergence with the landscape, emphasizing the inextricable link of the two elements through time and ecological process. Two small fragments of bone, she notes, have taken their hue from the bog water, which has also tinged much of the clothing. As Declan Kavanagh discusses, the bogs of early modern Ireland were often framed as anti-colonial and contested territories in which political narratives might play out, the symbolic and literal spaces of conflict. But they were also generative sites central to the country's contemporary economic health. They were harvested for both peat and, as this print from 1791 shows, flax, used in the manufacture of Irish linen. For the Countess, the bog was a gestational place, one that held the key to Ireland's future through both the production of industrially useful materials and the preservation and timely birthing to the surface of its past. And indeed, these two seemingly disparate registers combine in her reading of the site. Most enduring in terms of its legacy is the Countess's treatment of the fragmented textiles that were found with the preserved body and afterwards scattered around the local area. A focus not unsurprising when considered in the context of her public and often quite literally performative investment in the contemporary Irish linen industry and efforts to support the poorest working within it. Indeed, Lady Moira was widely known for her commitment to a knowledge of all stages of the manufacturing process, from bog harvesting to the dresses worn in her own salon. In his rather unglamorous and wordily titled Thoughts on the Necessity and Advantages of Care and Economy in Collecting and Preserving Different Substances of Manure, catchy, Thomas Bailey would go on to credit her with, quote, some very successful attempts to form amongst her poor neighbours a valuable manufacture for the refuse of flax and hemp. Her work in this area was long established. In 1768, 13 years before the bog body was raised, Lady Moira had hosted a masquerade in which her guests were required to attend wearing costumes made exclusively in Ireland using Irish linen, thus transforming their bodies, along with her own, into patriotic advertisements of a thriving nation. An anonymous poem printed at the request of the grateful artists of Ireland ran thus: each gallant youth and brilliant fair at Moira's kind request, in Irish manufactures rare, this grand assembly graced. Thus, whilst their pleasures they pursue, their country's good is held in view. Evidence of her investment in textiles and sartorial products as potentially historiographical as well as political tools appears in Joseph Cooper Walker's 1788 historical essay on the dress of ancient and modern Ireland. Such was the debt Walker felt that he owed to Lady Moira that he dedicated the work thus: when your ladyship condescended to promote my inquiries concerning the national dress of the Irish, the light which you shed on the subject beamed occasionally on their armour and weapons. Struck with the few peculiarities of them, I was induced to a closer inspection. Of the pieces to survive on the bog body itself, the Countess wrote, I expected to have some insight into the state of the flaxen and woolen manufactures of the native Irish of that period, since the wearing of their linen tunic was too rigidly prohibited by the English laws for any hope to get a sample of those habits, except by an incident of this nature, the incident being the uncovering of the body. Closely analysing the frayed edges, discoloured patterns, and unravelled threads of the scraps she was able to recover and preserve, the Countess surmised that the clothing was likely made in the style of Gaulish dress, a conclusion that presented historic Ireland favourably as a connected and powerful nation with access to intercontinental trade networks. But the textile fragments also told a more intimate history of the woman who wore them. By its size, Lady Moira surmised of the remains of a cape. It must have belonged to a slender person. Modes of making and wearing came to the fore in her account, in which the material details of the garment give rise to a sketch of their owner, and through which the Countess made implicit connections to the sophistication of 18th century Irish design and industry. She writes, the spinning and weaving are not the performance of rude artists, and the full herringbone toil in which it is woven is proof that the works of the loom were not in their infancy with the people thus clothed. The tangibility of the past and its overlapping with modernity were compelling. Imagining that which was lost, the rest of the garment, and the full body of the individual who wore it, the Countess filled in the empty spaces in between the past and present through conjecture, close interrogation, and even interventionist reproduction. I added a pattern of the sleeve and shoulder, she wrote, in an intervention that also included annexing a sample from a similar garment found at the site. But Lady Moira acknowledged such processes of imaginative replication came at a price. The hand that reached out across time to touch and translate historical presence was also necessarily the hand of destruction, unifying meters of endurance, creativity, and disintegration. Of the cape, she noted, since the discovery, it soon fell to pieces. Similarly, ornaments found upon the skull unraveled under inspection, and 2 plaits of human hair became, as the Countess has it, deranged by modern curiosity. The work of Catherine Downes and Lady Moira in excavating and recording these important archaeological sites and the finds recovered at them resonated beyond the initial events themselves. Publication in the Society's Archaeologia prompted wider engagement by the contemporary antiquary society, and so the wider community, and in the case of the Drumcerrig find, scholarly attention well into the 19th century. The publications resulting from Downes' efforts at Warminster, first in the Archaeologia and then afterwards in Vetusta Monumenta, enjoyed a legacy beyond initial interest in the excavation itself. Both the Vetusta and a separate pamphlet copy of Downes' account and the engraving done by Bezier appear, for example, in the 1815 library of collector and antiquarian Sir Richard Colt Hoare. But the years between the 1786 excavation and Hoare's acquisition, however, saw various claimants come forward to challenge the validity of Downes' work as an argument predicated on who should be credited with the Pitmead discoveries played out across print media. In December 1787, an anonymous article in the Gentleman's Magazine, written by a contributor only identified as W, provided an alternate description, an engraving independent of that set out by Downes. The report attacked, quote, the person to whom this discovery has been falsely attributed, while of Lord Weymouth's removal of the surviving mosaic to Longleat, the author overtly complained that a great part of it is already destroyed through the curiosity of the neighbouring virtuosi, who have broken it up and carried away the tesserae of which it is composed. In contrast, the work of Lady Moira in Ireland, both in recovering the fragmented and dispersed materials from the site and in her interpretation of the textiles found there, enjoyed a steadier legacy into the 19th century. In 1864, Sir William Wilde, author of several works on Irish archaeology and folklore and the father of Oscar Wilde, gave a paper at the Royal Irish Academy in which he declared Lady Moira's account appreciated for its learnedness and patriotism. Wilde ruminated, I find myself and others have often regretted that this remarkable discovery did not take place in our own time, so that the opportunity might have been afforded us of examining the costume or procuring it for the Museum of the Academy. In fact, Wilde did manage to acquire the artifacts for the Academy's collection, presenting them during his paper as a gift from Lady Moira's great-grandson. In 1890, the collection was transferred to the new Dublin Science and Art Museum, now the National Museum of Ireland, where they remain today. Despite their authors having little in common beyond their interest in archaeology, the endeavours of the two women that I've discussed tonight speak to broader technological, political, historiographical, and landscape developments in 18th century Britain and Ireland, all of which converged at the point in which the earth was broken and the objects from the past raised up. In undertaking such work, both Downes and Lady Moira were required to negotiate the complex scholarly territories traditionally closed to their gender, as well as those within which the archaeology itself was conducted. Their interventions at these sites raise important questions about the mobility and presence of women in the historical landscape, as well as their implication in the political and historiographical discourses of the time. From Downes' comparison of Roman pottery fragments to Mr. Wedgwood's teapots, to the Countess's linking of ancient cloth to her own efforts to revive Ireland's textile industry, both worked to connect the previous inhabitants of the land with those who occupied it in the present, and with that shone light on the implications in bringing the past to the surface. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Before I open the paper for discussion, can I just ask that, because we've got people online, that if people want to ask a question, they sort of make it known, and then we'll get a mic to you. And we'll also introduce questions that have been raised online via Danielle at the back of the room. Can I start by saying I find this exploration of 18th century antiquarianism and its gender aspects particularly fascinating. I wonder myself, if we look at Catherine Downes, how far we can get to the, in a sense, social networks that both work. You talk about potential networks of antiquarians in Wiltshire, but also how those networks, both locally and nationally, fit into this. Because I have a fairly clear understanding of small areas where I have touched on this. And I wonder whether there are ways that we can get to those individual networks, which clearly through correspondence and so forth are reflected in our minutes and so forth.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Yes, I think in the case of Downes specifically, it's something that I'm keen to find out more about. So thus far, and pandemic permitting, I have seen her minutes, the letter that was copied into the minutes, and obviously the printed account in the Vetusta Monumenta. And in that she does mention the unnamed gentleman of Warminster who encourages her, first of all, to send her report to the society, or rather requests that he will send it, whether that's under her name or to claim credit himself, but he never sends it. And so she does sort of take it upon herself. So she's obviously in some kind of dialogue at a local level with other people who are interested in this, specifically other men as well, which is I think presumably a sort of symptom of her own social standing. Yes, I mean, she's an elusive figure in the archive, and I would really like to know more. As far as I know, there's no correspondence other than the one letter that she sent to the society that exists.
Do we know much about her biographically through local sources?
No, I found nothing. No, I mean, now that the world is reopening, thanks to COVID, yeah, I'm kind of keen to maybe go to some local archives and see if I can find anything on her. She is very elusive, but it would be great to know more.
Can I open the paper for comment discussion? Danielle, you've got some online.
Thank you so much for an interesting paper this person starts with. They have noticed that the villa sites near West Warminster are close to water meadows, which are probably associated with the 18th century improvement. You show how in Ireland the Countess was interested in textiles. Is there any evidence that Downes had knowledge of or interest in agricultural developments in Wiltshire?
Thank you very much, person out in the ether, for that question. Again, because she is quite elusive in the archive, beyond the material that I'm working on, it's difficult to say for sure whether she had a specific interest in that. She does mention the agricultural workers at the site who are draining the land, and that does come up in her discussion of the site. The way that I've read her account is that she was most likely a middling woman who would have had a sort of social distance, how COVID appropriate, just in terms of class from the agricultural workers themselves. However, she is coming into contact with them in new ways, whether that is whether during the time when they're helping her to excavate, or rather they're excavating under her direction, whether she is engaging them in conversation about the wider work they're doing. It's hard to say, but I think she certainly has an awareness of the changes that are happening in the landscape, the work that's being done there, and that's presumably the way through which she finds out about the discovery of the site itself at a local level.
I have another one from the
Please.
internet. Where are most bog bodies found in the UK and Ireland?
Oh wow. Well, I should say I'm very much not an expert on bog bodies, so I would hesitate to answer that. I mean, obviously there's a fantastic display in Dublin of several Irish bog bodies. To my knowledge, not including the one that Lady Moira discovered, but that's maybe a good place to start.
I could give a good plug to Mel Giles's recent book on bog bodies for that question. Rowan.
Hi, thank you. I think the chances of finding out much definitively about Catherine Downs are pretty minimal.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, the question has always been, we don't actually know who the men involved were as well, because I mean, she says she excavated or oversaw the excavation, but what did that mean? I mean, did she pay the steward, or was she actually there overseeing the digging? I mean, we can conjecture a huge amount, but it might be much more exciting than we think, or it might be much more prosaic. And I don't think we're ever going to find. I mean, we might find that her husband belonged to a subscription library, and so she got hold of Camden's Britannia or something. But so I think, for me, the Countess of Moira is much more interesting, and fits into a tradition of female philanthropy in Ireland with stuffed balls and the kind of paternalist encouragement of local manufacturers, which goes right back, obviously, to the 1720s. And I'm wondering how much you've been able to find out both about Moira Library in Ireland, or also the family home she grew up in, and what were the influences that shaped her in childhood, because this kind of interest might have just suddenly developed in Ireland, but it seems to me it's much more like to be something that she grew up with in the family environment. And so I wondered how much work you've actually done on her familial context as opposed to the Irish context.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. The answer to that is very, very little so far. I'm really keen to pursue her as a much bigger case study, and to look at, I know that she's involved in translation of Gaelic as well, and this sort of performative element with the masquerades and this idea of especially sartorial reproduction is really interesting. Specifically,
but it's not her idea. She's following in a tradition of doing that, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of her familial context, that would be fascinating to know, and to know as well at what age this interest started, because the wider project that I'm sort of working on is interested in young girls' engagement in not just archaeology, but historical existing historical materials and antiquities, but also objects that are made by mothers, aunts, to explain history and to teach children about it. So it'd be interesting to see if she was dealing with anything like that growing up. But
male family members are quite important too. I mean,
yes, yeah.
I think fathers and brothers often. I mean, if you think of somebody like Dorothy, John Rylands Library, Dorothy.
Yes.
Yeah, you know what I mean. I mean, but that's. I mean,
yeah.
She's her interests they clearly stem from her father's interest. So I think the paternal influences are as important as maternal.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's the same for Catherine Hutton as well.
Yeah,
which is really fascinating.
And my other sort of slightly skeptical note is, I mean, somebody like Walker is desperate for patronage, so we do have to take everything with a pinch of salt, don't we? I mean, and there's also, I mean, there is that performative element, that how much is actually coming from the aristocracy, whether it's male or female, and how much is actually being projected onto the aristocracy by hopeful proteges or would-be proteges. And I think that's always quite a difficult one to disentangle, whatever the gender, because the only way in which you get supported to do this kind of research, if you are somebody like J.C. Walker, is by getting a wealthy person interested in what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And teasing that out, I think, is quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And just the fact that these discoveries and the sort of historical processes and their reproduction in the 18th century itself are kind of drawn into complex social negotiations generally, whether we can take them at face value or not. You know, I think just the fact that they are kind of embroiled in that is really interesting. Yeah, thank you, Rosemary.
The contrast between the social context of the two women is really very striking in that,
Yes.
that regard, isn't it? Are there any other, more online, I think?
Running off of the same question, do you have plans to track down the family of the Downs, or have you already tried?
Specifically for Catherine Downs, I'm kind of skeptical that there's any further archival material out there. It'll be amazing to discover some. So if anyone knows of any, please do let me know. In terms of Lady Moira, I'm really keen to, my next step will be to get across to Dublin and look into the archives there. I know that there's a huge amount of her correspondence that still survives and all sorts of family papers. So that'll be my next step.
I think it's the same person has also suggested that they found some information with Scottish antiquaries via the lawyers. Oh, it's gone, 1 second. Via the lawyers of their wills for the early 19th century onwards. So that might be where they're traceable.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Are there any other questions or comments?
I think we've got another one.
Okay, please.
If I may. Does evidence for women's antiquarian interests in the 18th century feed into the women getting involved in the beginnings of county societies in the 1850s-ish?
Well, as an 18th centuryist, I would hesitate to comment on anything into the 19th century. Yes, I mean, I'm sure that there is a pattern as we go into the 19th century of women becoming part of local and eventually national institutions and actually being allowed in these spaces. So yeah, I mean, it's not something I know a huge amount about, but thank you for the question.
I think that's it from online.
If there are no more questions, can we thank our speaker warmly for her contributions? And I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 28th of October at 5 p.m. and we will hear a paper, English Landscapes and Identities, by Professor Chris Gosden. Meeting stands adjourned.